was asked to extend Ambassador Dory Gold's apologies. He'll be coming soon. He's on a tour of the Jordan River Valley right now, and he's been held up. Otherwise, he would be here to introduce our speaker. It gives me great pleasure, and it's a true honor for me to introduce Ambassador Zalman Shoval. We served together in Washington. I was his Deputy Chief of Mission in the years 1999 and 2000, when he was in Washington for his second tour of duty. 98, 99, right. Most important 98, because that was also during the Y plantation talks, a very important time in U.S. Israel relationship and in the peace talks in the Middle East. Ambassador Shoval served 4 terms in the Knesset, served as ambassador twice in Washington, which I believe to this day is unprecedented, and is a keen observer of U.S. Israel relations and American political scene. He will speak, give his presentation, and then take time for questions and answers. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Zalman Shoval.
Thank you, Lenny. You know, it's quite unusual when an ambassador, former ambassador and the former deputy chief of mission still speak to each other. So, this is very nice. I must compliment the organizers of this event today. I mean, their timing couldn't have been better, of course, speaking about Israel-American relations. The subject, the official subject, if I remember correctly, in the invitation said U.S. Israel relations after the midterm elections. Some will say more of the same. And they may be right. After all, constitutionally, foreign policy is the domain of the administration, not Congress. So what difference does it make? Yeah, of course, there's a big Republican group in both houses now, especially in the House of Representatives. Many of them are friends of Israel. There will be committee heads, which are interesting from our point of view. But, you know, I'll get back to that, and I'll state my opinion about that perhaps later on. I think it may be appropriate. Of course, we don't have a whole semester in front of us now today, but it would be appropriate to give perhaps a very brief, certainly superficial overview of the relationship from the beginning between Israel and America, actually from before the beginning, because of course there was a Zionist movement in America, American Jews, Brandeis and others, and also at a certain time Zionist leaders from Israel, from Palestine, realized that America was going to be, certainly after the Second World War, going to be the center of decision-making, and therefore they shifted their center of activity, Zionist activity, where it used to be mostly in London, to America, to New York. And we must also remember that, and that I think that is a factor which did influence later developments, that during the Roosevelt years, although he was supported by a large majority of the Jewish community, and for good reasons, and so on and so forth, but that there were also more than a few downsides. One remembers the St. Louis ship affair. There was a certain person in the State Department, I think his name was Breckinridge, but I may be wrong, but I think it was Breckinridge, who was an all-out anti-Semite, and whenever Eleanor Roosevelt tried to influence her husband to do certain things to open the gates for refugees from Nazi Germany, he prevented that, and then there was the famous meeting between Roosevelt and King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, which is something one would like to forget. After the war, and I think because of the Holocaust, and because of the problem of the displaced persons, and the exodus ship being sent back to Germany, first to France, then to Germany, there was growing awareness and pressure in America on all sides to support the establishment of a Jewish state. One remembers the Anglo-American Committee, one remembers Barclay Crum, who was very active in that, and that pressure, without any doubt, influenced Truman, influenced people who played a very, very active role in favor of establishing the Jewish state. A guy called Clark Clifford, who is not necessarily remembered, I think, here in Israel, against the opposition of the State Department, of George Marshall no less, and others, against establishing the State of Israel, or recognizing the State of Israel, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that, okay, interest, everything is very important, but I think that in America, contrary to Europe, paradoxically, there was and still is a certain feeling of moral responsibility for what had happened to the Jews during the Second World War, and that as a result of that, is that mine? No, this is not mine. I didn't put this even on. That as a result of that, it was a good cause. It was a cause to be supported. Not that there were no problems. I mean, there was an arms embargo on Israel. Israel couldn't get legally any arms, even after the War of Independence had started. There were discussions and debates about Jerusalem and other things. And there was this traditional attitude of the CIA, among others, which also came to the fore on the eve of the Six-Day War later on, that, well, you know, Israel has no chance really of winning against all these Arab armies which are going to come down on her, and therefore America should not get involved too much because it's a losing cause. There were others who said, well, you know, the new Israel is going to be a Soviet satellite. I mean, Ben-Gurion and all those socialists, it's almost like communists. Therefore, we Americans should be wary. Ben-Gurion, I think, was very, very much aware from the very beginning of the importance, the paramount importance of the relationship with the United States. And in 1950, actually, he proposed sending a unit of the Israeli army to fight alongside the Americans in Korea. Not in order to, you know, really for military purposes, but for political purposes. America, I think, said no, thank you, but it was a gesture which was important. That relationship really continued all those years, with a very significant break in the middle, 1956, when our faces turned towards France. France had its own strategic interests involved, and so on and so forth, but that was really the exception to the rule and not the rule. It is very important, I think, and often forgotten, that till 1967, Israel did not get any foreign aid from America. I mean, there was Jewish aid, but there was something very insignificant called Point 4, some counterpart funds, agricultural, but no large-scale civilian aid, certainly no military aid. On the contrary, when Ben-Gurion wanted to buy planes at the beginning, you know, looking ahead towards a confrontation with Egypt, America wouldn't sell them. Wouldn't sell them. America put pressure on Canada not to sell them to Israel either, so the only source, of course, was France. And before that, during the War of Independence, the source was Czechoslovakia, which I'm happy to mention at this time when we have the Czech ambassador here. All that changed with the Six-Day War. After the Six-Day War, Israel became an asset, a strategic asset, a strong country, a country which can win in its wars against all the odds against its neighbors, an American reliable ally in the Cold War, as it was, serving America's strategic interests and at the same time giving America the possibility to support a strong factor and not someone who perhaps has to be supported and helped and so on and so forth. And this went beyond the military side of the relationship. There was always the growth of political and other relationships, cultural relationships, certainly economic relationships. And if we look at the foreign aid package, which Israel is still receiving, although in a different shape and different amount than it was in the past, this was all really a result of the changed perception after the Six-Day War. As a side remark right now, because we talked about military cooperation, I'll briefly jump ahead and say that the military or defense-related cooperation between Israel and the Obama administration is probably unprecedented in a good sense of the word, the positive sense of the word. And I think that is something to be taken into account of. Of course, so that started, let's say, de facto the so-called special relationship, which was based, and I'm telling you nothing you don't know, was based on the one hand on strategic interests, perception of Israel as a strategic partner, and indeed on the other hand on shared values. These were the two main building blocks. Shared values, okay, the usual stuff, important as it is, democracy, only democracy in the whole region, rule of law, justice system, etc., but not least the Bible. This was not always sufficiently understood in Israel, which is much more of a secular state perhaps than the United States is, where 80% go to church on Sunday of the people. But the Bible, and not only with the Southern Baptist or the Evangelist, is and has been and will be, I think, a very close link with political implications, without any doubt. After the end of the Cold War, our friend Tom Friedman wrote a column where he said, okay, this is the end of the strategic relationship. America doesn't really need Israel anymore from that point of view. Soviet Union is no longer there. But, in fact, and I must say that I said this at the time, I wrote that at the time, the dangers which have been growing up over the years from Muslim fundamentalism and the threat to Western civilization as a whole, terrorism and all these things which are involved in that, may be actually greater than the Soviet Union presented, certainly in the last few years of its existence. And it sometimes amazes me that there's not sufficient recognition in America today of this major threat to itself, to the West, of course, including Israel, but not just only Israel. I was, a few months ago, engaged in a sort of debate with John Brennan, who was the terrorist or anti-terrorist advisor of the president, when his whole focus was on Al-Qaeda. And I got up and said, look, of course Al-Qaeda must be dealt with, must be fought, must be eliminated. But there are others. There's Iran, there's Hezbollah, there's Hamas. You can't put on or keep on your blinders and ignore the overall fundamentalist terrorist threat, which is not only Al-Qaeda. Actually, I found it interesting that in his visit to Mumbai, to India, the president was asked exactly these questions by Indians, who of course had their own experience with terrorism, and he sort of evaded the issue. Now, of course, there are ups and downs. You have this view, which is represented by people like Brzezinski and others, who say, well, Israel, or the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, is the heart of the problem. The road to Baghdad leads through Jerusalem, if one remembers that. And unless that issue is eliminated, implying pressure on Israel, among other things, we, America, will continue to face unsurmountable problems in Afghanistan, wherever, and of course in the Arab world. I'm not completely denying that there is something in that, because the Iranians obviously are using it, whether they care about the Palestinians or not. But it's interesting that some of the people who were very much sharing that same view in the past, like Richard Haas, who was responsible for the Middle East in the Bush, the father administration, or our friend Aaron Miller, have changed their view. And Haas has said and written, because there will or won't be a Palestinian state, is not going to prevent Shiites murdering Sunnis in Iraq or vice versa. But you still have that debate, I think, going on in the United States, in Washington, and it has not yet been resolved. There are different people, even around the president, who have different views about that. One could also make a case, and I won't go at length into that, that Israel is actually a factor of stability in the Middle East, and not of instability as some people describe it. I could imagine that without a strong Israel, we might not have the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan at this point. We might not even have a Palestinian national movement, paradoxically, because the Palestinians, by that, if it hadn't been for strong Israel, might have been a department of the Ba'ath Party in Syria. And of course, Israel played a role in changing the attitude of the Egyptians, of President Sadat, with regards to their close or previously close relationship with the Soviet Union. So, are all these consequences of the Six-Day War? Yes, they are, but there are also other consequences. In the political, bilateral and multilateral field, America has never changed, let's say in detail, its position on Jerusalem, borders, settlements if you want. The position has been more or less clear, although there were different points of emphasis. First of all, Resolution 242 at the Security Council of the United States, of the United Nations, a resolution, by the way, which the Palestinians are now trying to change, and that's really their agenda at this present moment, very clearly recognized the need for secure borders. Call them secure, call them defensible borders, but certainly not en masse going back of Israel, withdrawal of Israel to the former Green Line, about which, if we remember, President Reagan said that this is something that Israel should never be asked to do, to go back to this former volatile line. And people forget, I mean, if it hadn't been for that, maybe the whole Six-Day War wouldn't have broken out in the first place. There wouldn't have been occupation, and there wouldn't have been all these issues. So, but the basic position has been all along the same on the American side. One remembers the Rogers Plan and so on and so forth. But different periods brought about different points of emphasis. Sometimes it was a major issue, sometimes it was not so much a major issue, and that depended very, very often on, as I said, extraneous issues which do or do not directly relate to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One example which really, I would say, illustrates both sides of this issue was the big loan guarantee controversy with the Bush-Baker administration, Yitzhak Shamir being prime minister here. And, of course, that's also something which one should remember. Even Baker, even Bush, contrary to the Europeans, never declared the settlements to be illegal. They went about it in an orderly fashion. They asked the legal counsel of the White House to give an opinion, and the opinion was no, it was not illegal. Israel has rights, Palestinians have rights, and therefore the administration from that day onwards used the term obstacle to peace. Okay, but not illegal, not in the lexicon of the American administration or American administrations. But coming back to that loan guarantee, which was related to the question of settlements, because it was conditional on Israel stopping, building, or expanding, because of changed political circumstances, both in the United States ahead of the Bush-Clinton elections, and of political circumstances in Israel with the election of Yitzhak Rabin, all of a sudden a way was found. Construction, building in the territory, certainly in Jerusalem, continued full strength, no impediment. The only thing that was agreed upon was that certain amounts, not fantastic amounts, were deducted from those loan guarantees. Okay, Israel could live with that, and America lived with that. And that's an example of how things, under certain circumstances, can be worked out in spite of the basic position of the United States in that respect. Now, here we are now in the present situation, and after the midterm elections, which is part of the official topic of my talk today. So, some people say the president has been, is there a word, hobbled? Is there a word like that? Hobbled, I think it is when you put the horses, right, the legs of the horse together. So the president has been hobbled, hasn't he? And Congress is friendly to Israel, and it is more friendly perhaps than it was. Maybe. It is certainly a very friendly Congress. Among other things, now I'm talking politically, not diplomatically, because the group of the Friends of Israel, or if you want to say the Jewish unofficial caucus, who are mostly, with very few exceptions, Democrat, were all re-elected, I think with one exception, perhaps two. That means that their weight, their proportionate weight, inside the Democratic group in Congress, in the House of Representatives, is actually greater than it was in the past. Plus, of course, the Republicans, many of whom are indeed friends of Israel. So all of that is true. And if you add to that that the new committee heads are decidedly some of the more important committees pro-Israel, but you must also say that their predecessors were just as pro-Israel as the new ones. Ilyana Ross-Lehtinen, who's going to head the Foreign Relations Committee of the House of Representatives, is proven friend and supporter of Israel. But so was Howard Berman. So I don't really see a major shift, but it does, I would say, make a certain imprint on the relationship, and also some other committees which will deal with America's own anti-terrorist efforts, or those committees which deal with arms exports, are basically in the hands of people who are not only support Israel, but understand from their point of view the importance of the relationship between America, the American people, and Israel, and the Israeli people. And but there are questions. Not all the Republicans are of the same ilk. People have different views. What will be the views, for instance, on foreign aid, or on including perhaps military aid? And there's another question. Is there a Tea Party foreign policy? I wonder. You hear conflicting views from heads of this movement, some of which are basically internationalist, others are very fundamentally isolationist. So I think there are still questions in the future, but I don't necessarily see this as a sea change, but really more of a continuation, perhaps under somewhat more favorable terms for Israel. But there's a question we must ask ourselves. Do we really want a weakened American presidency? Which means a weakened America, especially in this part of the world, where the only possible alternative to a weakened America is a strengthened Iran. Yes, I admit that in Israel there is a certain ambivalence in our attitudes. Maybe there's ambivalence on both sides. And I do refer to the U.S. administration time to time attitudes to the present government of Israel. But basically, Israel wants and needs a strong American presidency. And in the greater scheme of things, Israel needs and wants a number one power, because there's no vacuum, there's no void. And we have seen the attempts by Turkey and Brazil and others to replace the American dominance, which I think is not working in favor of Israel. So I must repeat again that we should remember that in America it is the president who makes foreign policy. He doesn't act in a vacuum again. He doesn't act in splendid isolation. The Congress, both its houses, the Congress is not the Knesset or any other parliamentary or any other parliament in the European democracy. Congress is a branch of the government. It has powers to constrain, to restrain, to expand, and sometimes it does influence administration policies, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, because if Jim Baker used to say money is fungible, policies or politics are also fungible. When you have to play off one thing against the other, yes, Congress can certainly have an influence, without any doubt. Even though this president may sometimes have a view of the world and of history which is not necessarily linked to reality, at least in my view, or facts on the ground, I do believe that not only have the basic ingredients of the U.S. Israel relationship not weakened, nor have the common political and strategic interests of both, certainly not of Israel, but I think of America, after some self-examination, also not. Right now, if you read the Israeli press, and not just the Israeli press, there seem to be two schools of thought. those who say Obama, in order to be re-elected, will have to concentrate in the next 2 years almost exclusively on domestic policy, especially, of course, the problematic economic issues, and something which the press here has not paid sufficiently, I think, attention to is not only the gains or the victories of the Republicans in Congress, but the even more impressive gains in the houses of the governors, which has a major impact on the next presidential elections, if we understand the way American politics work. So it's not going to be, it's an uphill struggle for the president to be re-elected in 2012. So the theory is he's going to concentrate on domestic policy. He has to, but will he be able to? Because he will need the support, or at least the cooperation, of the Republicans. Will they or won't they? That's something which I think is still up in the air. Not here, but in Washington. And if he won't have the support to deal with the domestic issues, or whether his domestic programs will fail for other reasons, he may indeed concentrate, which he didn't do in the last few months of the election campaign. After all, he was not the candidate, but his party was. He may try to shift the attention to foreign policy issues. What foreign policy issues? The problem, the situation in Iraq is going to continue to be problematic, to say the least. The war in Afghanistan, okay, one wishes the Americans well. It's also Israel's interest. And also the Republicans are divided on that. But the chance that the United States will be able to declare victory within 2 years, it's, let's say, to say the least, questionable. Therefore, the theory goes, there's one issue in foreign policy he may want to concentrate on, that's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which means, perhaps, pressure on Israel, as some people fear and some people hope for in this country. But again, this is not a clear-cut, black or white sort of question or dilemma. What happens if any plan on the part of the administration does not bring the results? After all, there are many, I would say, precedents over the years where there were American initiatives which did not really bring any results. Let's say if it fails again. And I think that one may assume that an American initiative which is not supported by a consensus, or more or less a consensus in Israel, does not have too many chances of really creating a breakthrough. Why should President Obama and his administration court potential failure again? So I'm not convinced by the counter-argument, namely that, yes, because he has problems in the economy and the health, the reform, and all those other domestic issues, he will want to concentrate on the Israeli-Palestinian issue in order to show success within 1 year or within 2 years. And I would not be greatly surprised, because this may also be in the interest of Israel, that the approach will be more nuanced or more graded, whatever the word is, that, yeah, talks will go on, agreements will be made, the economic situation in the territories will be improved, security measures will be coordinated, but whether this will actually lead to the sort of end of the problem, end of conflict, I personally have grave doubts, and I would not be surprised listening, for instance, to Hillary Clinton the other week making a statement to a Palestinian-Israeli, a Palestinian-American group that she's optimistic on the peace process in spite of the problems. Maybe agreement won't be reached in our time, but in the time of our children, which was quite amazing coming from Hillary Clinton. But maybe people in Washington are being aware more than they were a year ago that this is not an issue which can be solved quickly. And you will say quickly, it's going on for 100 years, but still quickly. And that there are problems which can never be solved, or at least not speedily. And there have been precedents in the world in that respect. And that both sides, I mean now Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama, will come, and maybe are coming these very days or these very hours, to whatever the public declarations may mean, to some sort of pragmatic working relationship, because basically they need each other in order to succeed, or at least in order not to be seen as abject failures. So, am I optimistic or pessimistic about the relationship? I'm realistic. It will go on, it will have its ups and downs, but it will not break. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will take questions. Please wait for the microphone. And please identify yourself, because this is being recorded, and so we want to know who is asking the questions. First question here.
Should I take together, or what?
Let's go one at a time at the beginning.
One at a time, okay.
I'm Patrick Martin from the Globe and Mail newspaper of Canada. Ambassador, you mentioned that the current president has policies that are not always linked with reality. Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, well, for instance, there is this, I'll give you two answers, but they're not conflicting. There is this attitude in the administration that Al-Qaeda is really something out of the general rule of what's happening in the Muslim world. And if we, America, can eliminate Al-Qaeda and kill Osama bin Laden, the problem will be over. It's a much bigger issue. Of course there are moderate Muslims. Of course there are many. There are moderate Muslim states, Arab states, which have a basic interest to fight against extremism. But their voice is not sufficiently heard, their influence is not sufficiently felt, and what stands behind the Islamist, not Islamic, but Islamist approach is really to change the world, not to reach an agreement on this or that, but to change the world and to create a new situation, I think, of the free Western democratic world being not under the rule, but certainly under the thumb of revived Islamism. And as I said in my talk, this exclusive concentration on Al-Qaeda is counterproductive, because Iran is probably the worst, not worse, but at least as bad a factor in international worldwide terrorism than Al-Qaeda is. So, the other thing is that you had this, especially at the beginning of this administration, the American administration, that really everything depended on whether Israel does or doesn't build across the Green Line. Okay, this has been a traditional American approach all the way back to '67. But it was never, with few exceptions, the only focus of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And by supporting that argument, especially in the beginning, the Americans can be faulted, the administration can be faulted for getting the Palestinians up on such a high horse or such a high tree, where even a man like Abu Mazen finds it very difficult to get down from. Why should they be more moderate than the Americans? There was a certain change in let's say 6 months, 7 months after the installation or the installment of the administration. But since then there have been ups and downs. And I basically do not accept the position that if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be solved anyway, in any form or fashion, the problems which America faces in the Middle East, and the broader Middle East, will go away. They won't. On the contrary, there's quite a distinct possibility that Iran and its supporters will say, okay, that was stage one, now comes stage two. We're not really only against Israel being the territories, we're against Israel as a whole. And if you listen to statesmen, politicians in the Arab world, the moderate Arab world, you will hear very often the theme or the thesis that if America would put its the Iranian issue first, then other issues will be easier to solve. But the official attitude, which I think is unrealistic, still is only if we solve the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and I refer to that, then will we be able successfully to tackle Iran. I think this is putting things on its head, on their head.
This is David, JCPA. I'd like to ask you now if maybe we have some, in the near future, some taste of the actual policy of the administration after the elections in the Congress, while the Arab League or Arab countries will apply to the United Nations Security Council to recognize Palestinian state along 67 borders. And they hope that the United States will not veto this time this resolution. What is your take on this? How they will behave?
I can't speak for the administration, but I think I hinted at that. The Palestinians, and that's not a new idea, it's been growing over the last 3-4 years. In 2 stages. Stage 1, try to adopt a new resolution at the United Nations Security Council which will not officially eliminate 242, but supersede it. It will not have the term of the definition of secure borders. It will not refer to the question of where or how Israel should withdraw, not from all the territory. No, but it should say Israeli withdrawal in order to create Palestinian state, which would create a new reality, obviously. If the Palestinians, and so far this has been a Palestinian proposal, not an Arab League proposal yet, and I'm not sure whether all the Arab members of the Arab League are really in favor of that. But if that would come to fore, if that would come in existence, it would put an end to the peace process. Because the peace process, in many measures, or in many regards, depends on the agreed formula of 242, and number 2, on the Oslo Agreement. As much as I oppose the Oslo Agreement, but the Oslo Agreement is still the legal framework of many of the negotiations. If all that is being done away with, then we are back not to square one, but behind square one. Israel, of course, could act militarily against something which goes against agreements. I don't think Israel will appreciate that chance or will want to prefer that chance. But my feeling is that America, which sees itself as the, I want to say godfather, but godfather has a bad connotation, the patron, let's put it like that, and it is, of the political situation here, of the political process, of the peace process, whatever way you're going to call it, should certainly not give its support for something which would altogether do away with the agreed framework of the peace process. I mean, the framework so far has been agreed and was agreed. Well, okay, so we say the Palestinians shouldn't put any preconditions. The Palestinians say you shouldn't create facts on the ground. But it's still all in the same agreed framework of 242 and even Oslo. And if that's done away with, we are not in a good situation. Peace is not in a good situation. And any sort of even interim solution. I'm not someone who hopes for absolute solutions. And I don't know if you know Professor Yecheskel Dror, who said the other day, even if there is a Palestinian state based on an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, this does not necessarily mean the end of the conflict. So we must be realistic about it, and I hope America will be realistic about it.
Question? And I have one, if you like prerogative. When you were ambassador, the Americans, on several occasions, even then, raised questions about the settlements. But what were the other issues that you felt were particular problems to the relationship and to the peace process then that have either that still remain or have been resolved?
Well, one issue has definitely been resolved by the declaration of the Prime Minister of Israel heading a Likud-based government in support of the Palestinian state, so the so-called two-state solution. That is something which is extremely different from anything which went before that. And this wasn't the question, but if I may add my 2 cents worth, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is one of the few people, perhaps, who believes he can achieve an agreement with the Palestinians and wants to and moves forward, hopefully, or whatever one's view is. He may be right, he may be wrong, but I think he does want to have an agreement, even if it's a framework agreement or a partial agreement. Why? Because he, better than many others before him, realizes the real great dangers facing Israel from Iran. And therefore, although there's no direct trade-off between these two things, Netanyahu was actually, I wouldn't say torn, but certainly linked to two foci, or to two centers of attention. The Palestinian issue, which is not just a political issue, it's also a security issue. Where will the borders be? How will Israel maintain its security position in the Jordan Valley, which is very important, especially with a growing threat from Iran inside Iraq. That means we might have this so-called Eastern Front 30 minutes away from here. And that's a very important security issue. But the pressing security issue of Iran, and the Prime Minister, to the best of his ability, is trying to maneuver between these two poles, which sometimes creates difficulties, obviously. But I think he's consistent in that and persistent in that, and we may see perhaps some outcome in that direction from the present meetings which he has in the United States, hopefully.
Question here, yes, please.
Johannes Görler from the Christian Media Association, Kiev in Germany. You didn't mention at all the Europeans, and when you said a weak American president, the alternative is Iran, a stronger Iran. Can you say something about the role of the Europeans in this whole Israeli-American relationship?
Well, I will try to keep polite. I'm a great, Israelis to a large extent, although everybody says America's here, in many, I would say, respects, we're more European than Americans. Our culture, and not only the Ashkenazi culture, the Sephardi culture was born to a larger extent in Spain. So, but the role Europe has been playing, and not just with regards to the Middle East conflict, has not always been helpful. I'll give you one minor or major example. There was a definite agreement 2.5 or 3 years ago, which was reported to us by the then Czech foreign minister, Mr. Schwarzenberg, I think, that the relationship between Israel and the European Union would be upgraded unconditionally. It's still not upgraded. There's always a new excuse or reason or alibi, whatever, not to follow through what had been agreed. But there's another thing. Look, with all the problems that America faces, and they are severe, and certainly we wish them well, Europe is reducing its contribution to NATO, it's reducing its defense budgets, and it has certain interests on the economic sphere which are not very helpful to really taking an objective, even-handed approach to the problem. So we appreciate Europe, we want Europe's support, but I cannot see by any means Europe fulfilling a role which America might be forced to vacate, and I hope it won't vacate.
Two questions over here, one and then two.
Ethan Bronick from the New York Times. You spoke about the importance of a strong American president and a strong America. So in this last year and a half, this president has asked repeatedly for a freeze on settlements. And by resisting it, although of course there was a partial freeze, I'm wondering your view now, not the view of the government, whether in fact it would have been more helpful to do it and to do it again, ideally, in order to boost his standing in the world and his ability to make it look like he is in charge, or whether you think it's more important to stand up to him in these circumstances.
Okay, I'll try to answer the question. The position or the relative position of the United States and its president in the world may be affected, I think marginally, but may be affected by what's going on here, what the Israeli government decides to do or not to do. But I'm sure you know that there's so many other issues, from the foreign debt, the budget deficit, the way the conference on the global conference. I mean, all different issues where America's position has been negatively affected. And even if Netanyahu would have come out with, I don't know, destroying settlements or something like that. By the way, are you aware of the fact that 67 of the existing settlements were built under the Labour government and not by Likud governments? And that, for instance, the now defunct settlement in the Gaza Strip was exclusively a Labour effort, which was opposed by many people on the right for different reasons. With regards to the present situation, I was asked that question by one of your confreres this morning. I said, look, Netanyahu, contrary to what people say about him, doesn't want to play inside American politics. If he would have said, like the argument goes, I will help Obama or the Democrats by freezing settlements for another 2 or 3 months, never mind that the Palestinians at the end of the 3 months will want another 3 months, another 30 months, I don't know what, and then people on the Republican side would have said, what is this? Are you playing American politics? He wanted to be out of it. And we have had bad experiences in that respect when the late Ezra Weizmann came out in support of Carter and the Republicans won. And Rabin, when he came to America as the re-elected prime minister, refused to see Bill Clinton and Al Gore because he didn't want to hurt Bush. And Senator Lautenberg and I had to make, you may remember that, a major effort to persuade Rabin to see the Democrats. Well, everything worked out very well. After that, became good friends. But you have this sort of thing. I think Netanyahu just wanted to keep out of it, and perhaps rightly so.
Richard Meyer from the United Nations. I wanted to test your thesis on the strength of ties between Israel and the U.S. A number of commentators within the American Jewish community have suggested that beyond the American Jewish establishment, there is a real change in attitudes amongst younger generations, amongst American Jews, and indeed other constituencies that have been traditionally supportive of Israel. Of course, we are seeing growing support amongst those amongst some Republicans and some within the Tea Party movement, but amongst Israel's traditional allies in the U.S., don't you see a change going on, and one which I think, if not to damage the ties, at least test or change the ties between Israel and America?
Some things which were almost seen as mantras in the last few years have been proved totally wrong. And this, it's not no surprise for me, but I think it is now being underscored. The so-called thesis of Mershon and the other guy, for God's name, that it is Israel or the Jewish lobby which pushed America into the war with Iraq. There were some people who definitely wanted America to fight Saddam Hussein, like Elie Wiesel and others. But most people connected with the Israeli case said the first priority should be Iran, not Iraq. So we didn't play a real effective or practical role in that. Is there a change? Yeah, the change does not necessarily, part of it does relate to the political situation, territories, occupation, and so on and so forth. There is a new generation of Jewish people in America who, as a fruit of their great success in everything they do, have less, unfortunately, of a visceral link with the state of the Jewish people, with Israel. They don't have the experiences of their parents, Holocaust, creation of the state of Israel. They support Israel, but it's not for them a life and death issue. On top of that, unfortunately, in the American universities, there is a far-out left trend to equate a lot of the Palestinians, without really getting into the nitty-gritty of the issues, with all the underdogs of this world, from the former slaves in America to the Africans or other populations around the world. And this is one of the factors of delegitimization of Israel, unfortunately, especially on the far left, also on the far right, but especially not only on the far left, even on the center left. But I don't really think that the support, by and large, of the American Jewish community, although it may not be as vocal as it used to be in certain times of crisis, is still very strong. Israel will have to do a lot about that. Ben-Gurion used to say, Israel must be, or should be, a light upon the nations. Okay, we first of all have to be a light upon ourselves in order to be a light upon the nations, and not everything is perfect. We're getting into another area now, but I think Israel has to do something about conversion. We have to do things which will make it easier for Jewish people around the world to support Israel in the framework of what I said before, shared values. And that's an important point, in my view.
Zalman, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you very much for
Thank you
very
for hosting.
erudite.
Thank you.
I think you can understand why I so much enjoyed serving with Ambassador Shoval in Washington. A reminder,
I'll tell you, there's a problem. Every time they appoint me to be ambassador to Washington, the guy who appointed me loses the election. So maybe this is an omen, I don't know. We should have stayed on for a few years, but anyway.
actually I stayed on an additional year. in fact.
Okay.
But I want to remind you, already during our tenure in Washington, we were sent, one of our missions was to warn the administration and members of Congress of the danger of Iran. We were focusing on missilery that was being developed in Iran. We
No,
would,
also nuclear already, but we were poo-pooed by. Don't write this down, please. The journalists. We were poo-pooed by the people around Mr. Gore, who said, "Well, I can deal with the Russians." That was the question of Russian support, and they didn't. Here comes the men of the defensible borders in the Jordan Valley. Is everything okay?
They're still defensible.
Okay. Unfortunately, although the CIA, I think, did support our stance, we were not really supported by the administration. And, okay, I'm not saying that everything that happened after that is a result of that, but it is part of that, I think. We did, I think, if we go back to 1999, we did give specific warnings about what was happening or may be happening in Iran. Was not taken sufficiently seriously, I'm afraid.
correct. Ladies and gentlemen, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and the Institute for Contemporary Affairs, thanks you for joining us. We want to announce that there will be more programs, so watch your emails and your faxes.